The next speaker is Professor Annette Reinberg from the University of Copenhagen. And Annette was the chair of the Global Land Project Scientific Steering Committee for 5 years during 2006 to 2011, if I'm correct. And Annette has been shaping a lot of the land science as it is today. And similar to Eric, she will also probably tell a story that things are not as simple as we thought and have become more complex when we looked into the system in more detail, with urban areas coming in and other things coming in. So I'm looking forward to your talk. The floor is to you, Annette.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity to tell a little bit about what I think we achieved in the first 5 years of the Global Land Project, and maybe also repeating a few of the things that Eric have already said, but I think it's difficult to coordinate these things. So what I will try to do is to start to tell a little bit about the mindsets that we have taken over with the start of GLP from the LOC program, and then I will look into only a few selected perspectives which I think have evolved during the GLP era. I cannot cover everything, so I have picked up a few things that I think are interesting and maybe interesting in a looking forward perspective, and these are distal connections, historical processes, land intensification, and conceptualization across the rural-urban divide. And then I'll wind up by saying a few things about novel conceptual angles and issues of importance. So just to remind the few persons in the room here that do not know too much about the Global Land Project, what it is about, I think it's captured in this diagram here. It's about integrating disciplines across scales, develop new analytical tools, and integrating biophysical and social dimensions in order to understand better the processes of change in human environmental systems. When we look back to the LOC program, which was led by Erik Bang, and really actually was a big leap forward in land change science as I see it, I think that they achieved a lot, summarized in this book that we have here, and we have a very high level of knowledge about mapping, monitoring, and modeling land use and land cover, and exploring proximate and underlying drivers of change, and doing that in a more systematic fashion, and also assessing ecosystem services, as also Erik alerted to. But there were also at the offset of GLP some very knowledgeable conceptual gaps, and one was identifying causal relationships in these complex socio-economic system or human environmental systems. Also the issue of handling distant connections, that was also alerted to by Eric, by the soy example, for instance, was something which has not really been dealt with in a very thorough way. And then the exploration of cascading effects was also something which has been difficult to wrestle with. I think that if you look to the papers written in the recent 5 to 10 years, two very prominent notions has been penetrating them, and they were emerging from these land use, land cover endeavors. And one of these were the notion of the proximates and underlying drivers. And this has been, I think, very helpful to frame a lot of studies in a systematic manner, and also do some meta-studies which have been providing knowledge. And it has been very good in that sense, but it's also acknowledged that it's not very good at capturing the feedback effect, as also already mentioned in the earlier presentation. And the other notion which has been very successful in getting into the literature is the notion of the land use transition, which was presented by John Foley in a paper in the mid zeros. And this actually indicates, as a diagram on your right-hand side here, that we have a sort of perceived transition from extensive to more intensive land use. But also this notion is helpful in one way, but also lack the ability to look at possible leapfrogging between different stages, or even simultaneous changes or reversals of changes. So it sort of leads you into a specific way of thinking of things that may be useful sometimes, but also may not be so constructive in other times. But turning to these four issues that I think I would like to put a few more words on. The first one is the distal connections, or the issue which have been labeled teleconnections or telecouplings in recent literature about this theme. And I think the emerging concern has already been described by the case of the soybean production and the pig production and the new demands in the emerging markets in China, for instance, where we have a huge demand for pork, which accelerates then the need for soybean production, which is then accelerating the land use change in Argentina and Brazil, as Erik also used as a study. And I think this is something which is obviously very complex to investigate and needs us to look into one way or the other these distal connections and how triggers in one part of the world actually causes changes in the other part of the world. And the notion of the land use transition could be helpful in that respect. But as I said before, it doesn't really work 100% perfect in capturing the issues of spatiality and temporality in a constructive way. Land use transition is basically very place-based in the way it perceives things. We consider people using things in one place and the effect in the same place, whereas de facto these may be spread over the globe in very complex manners. And it also has this sort of pre-perceived perception of successive changes from one state to the other and in a predetermined sequence of things. If we introduce, and that was what we did in a paper in 2012 in connection with urban issues, the teleconnection perspective, then it would put the focus on the distal connections more explicitly and also suggest that we could have leapfrogging between the different stages so that we could change from one state in this diagram to another one which is not immediately adjacent in the description here. And also multidirectional changes could be possible. And as I said, we primarily developed this for an urban teleconnection framework, which tried to wrestle a little bit with the fact that in the real world we do not have an urban-rural distinction in land use, but actually very complex relations between rural and urban uses and even urban lifestyles in rural areas, which are basically influencing the way in which people decide about land uses. And these are important things to consider in the way you conceptualize your work. So this is something that has then inspired the community to think even more closely about these things and further develop the notion of teleconnection, which was in the offset borrowed from climate science, to be developed into a notion which is then suggested to be called telecoupling, which is described in this diagram, which is emerging from a book which is just coming out actually in a week's time or so. I have a copy here which will be for display outside, and it is the outcome of a very intensive exercise with 40 international scholars in land change science, most of which are actually in the room here, I would guess, or quite a big number, and supported by the Anne Stroman Forum. And one of the synthesis activities here tried to think about how should we best perceive these connected human environmental systems. And I think that what is extra to this way of looking at it is that it looked at one human environmental system, which is the system A here, which influence, and that could, for instance, be the production system in Europe, which influence then another coupled human environmental system. And if we use the case of the pig production, that could be the system in Brazil or in Argentina. And then there's a feedback caused by some actors that influence then the initial system. So the important add-on to this in relation to what I talked about in the teleconnection is that we recognize that we really have to look into these feedback mechanisms in order to understand the development and the change processes that are going on in the land systems. And I think that the other case, curiously enough, I've picked the two cases that Erik so nicely showed on his slide are the rapidly changing land uses on a global scale. Palm oil and soybean, they are really one that are accelerating if you look into the FAO statistics. And if you can look at this example, you will also see that a very sort of broad demand for palm oil, mostly for food purposes, actually spread all over the world, is resulting in a huge change in a very concentrated place in Southeast Asia. But this is also influenced by some feedback mechanisms, because you have awareness through roundtable organizations that try to influence the whole value chain and commodity chain of palm oil to mitigate the bad environmental impact that these huge encroachments of palm oil plantations have on the local environment. Another issue of importance that I think has been emerging over the last 5 to 10 years is that we need to acknowledge and look into historical processes as well. And I think that just picking a few examples that will be known by the audience here, one is actually from the work done at this university, this institution here, where we can see that this is the upper left diagram, that there are huge differences in land use changes if we go just across the border in the same region from Slovakia to Poland. And of course, this is rooted in the basic historical political differences in these two regions. And if you take another example on the right hand, it's just, I would say, a random shot from Google at the fringe or the suburban area of Copenhagen. And one can, on the one hand side, recognize that the original allotment structure around the village is still intact. And you can also see that the encroachment of industrial areas are actually following the same patterns, obviously because you have user rights and tenure rights that are in these sort of original agricultural settings, but are now in a completely other setting. So the patterns remain frozen for many more years than the functionality is actually the same. So I think we need for the future also to seek some inspiration, and I think there's a lot of work to do here for the next generation to look into past dependencies, pathways, legacies, and maybe also syndromes. And a lot of this work has been done outside this community, and maybe we could look into some of the achievements here in order to seek inspiration for this. The historical processes has also been something that we have been trying to develop in one of the big projects that I consider one of the achievements of GLP, to get a huge EU project that are looking into land use changes in Europe and looking at processes as well as assessments and visions and pathways of development. I won't go into a lot of details because I've looked into the program and can see that there will be a lot of presentations dealing with this very issue, so I think I wouldn't do a lot to talk about this here. So the third issue of importance I think I would like to mention is the issue of land intensification. And I'm sure that some of you have read carefully the Global Land Project Science Plan, and this is actually one of the things that has been noted as something which has not been investigated in depth and would deserve extra attention. So there are some gaps in terms of full insight with regard to the mechanisms of intensification, determinants of intensification and constraints of intensification, just actually knowing what is the intensity of the use of various agricultural land. You can look up in the statistic and see you have a cultivated field, but you cannot see how intensely used it actually is, and it makes a lot of difference. This is an area where there have been a lot of theoretical writings in the historical time of geography. We have prominent scholars that have been working with input intensification, such as Boserup, and early work by Billy Turner, Rodenberg, and Brookfield. I'm sure that many of you will know about this. And a person like Netting has looked into it in terms of output intensification. And some has touched upon the new dimensions of system level impacts of various sorts. But in a systematic manner, there's still a lot to do in this. And a very first important step, I think, has been published very recently by Karl-Heinz Erb and others, suggesting that we have another or a refined framework for land use intensity analysis, which includes, as it's featured here in the diagram, the input side, the output side, as well as the system property side in the conceptualization of intensity. I think this is not the final word that can be said about this, but I think that there are some very good steps forward in this that deserves more reflection in the future. Then the last point I would like to draw in front is the conceptualization of land use across the rural-urban divide. And as I said before, we were lucky, and this is Karen Sito and myself, to earn an Ernst Strongman Forum to invite a lot of leading people to think about global land use in an urban area. This was a collaboration between the urban UJEC project and the GLP project, and I think that we have come up with some interesting things that I would really invite you to read at that point in time when it comes in a week or so. What we did set off to do was to look at the impact or the influence of some important trends in contemporary world, which were listed as urbanization, integration of economies, and new land agents and priorities and practices. And we suggested for the group that we have a sample in Frankfurt to look into it through different lenses that are not mutually exclusive but might guide some of the discussion. And they are also put in the cube here, and that's competition for land use. It's distal connections, which have been touched upon several times by myself and Erik already. It's the decision-making and governance, which are also important, and it's the normative issues, which is something that we have not dealt a lot with in relation to sustainability so far. And the ways forward that we could sort of dig out of the discussions that we had here could be summarized in 5 points, and they are: the time and space interdependencies need to be looked into, distal connections, again, moving away from territorial definitions to more sort of network-based perceptions, revaluation of land, and equity and fairness. And I'll just point to a few of them. I think I have a couple of minutes still to go. One of them could be this moving away from territorial definitions. And I think if you look again into the classical theoretical backbone of geography and land use, you will note on the left-hand side here, there's a number of nice diagrams that have been persistently shown in the literature, and they are all very place-based and sort of spatially well-defined. Whereas the whole notion of networking, alluded to also by Erik, the value chain and commodity chain, all this is not very well dealt with in these type of diagrams and theories. So I think we need to develop something that acknowledge this, and there's actually just a very, very recent paper that came out in Geoform, written by Darla Monroe, also one of our colleagues here in this network. And I think that she points to some of the inherited experience from global production networks, for instance, as something that may be a useful take on some of this and deserves further collaboration and internalization in the land use community. This is basically economic geography that has been working with this. And the other pick I would take from the list of 5 is the revaluation of land, which I think is also something which is may have potentially very, very huge implications for the way in which we use land. The value of land was also mentioned by Erik in slightly different way, but I think that in many ways we have experienced in the last 10 years or so new values given to land, which has major implications for the decisions about land use, and of course then also major implications for the way in which we will understand land uses and the dynamic of change in land use. And I think a couple of examples could be the whole discussion about biofuel and the use for land for biofuel and a carbon offset. Another example could be the value given to land by social values or nature values and other things that are to be appreciated. And I think that the debate on land share, land spare, for instance, would be a perfect example to illustrate this. And I know there will be others speaking about this later in this conference. So I think that this was what I could manage to share with you in my 20 minutes here. So thank you for inviting me.